In the universal essential, all good subsists in conscious readiness. This fine force is the skill of demonstration in itself. Therefore, whoever looks directly toward it, instead of toward instruments and methods, must make a draft upon it for deftness and skill in bringing to pass good works of whatever kind he chooses. It's conscious ownership of all things, and therefore whoever looks straight to it must, if looking by the understanding of his mind and not his physical endeavors, find that he draws upon it for plenty. He cannot help but bring his sustenance from it when he understands it as sustenance. I want to tell you how I became a physician. In the 1970s, I had gone to Israel. I was all excited about studying Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah. I was at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. When I was there, the Yom Kippur War took place. Israel was attacked by all of its neighbors on Yom Kippur, the most sacred day of the Jewish year, and I was there at the time. I remember walking through the streets on Yom Kippur. I was damned if I was going to be in a synagogue. I regarded myself as a free thinker in many ways and hated organized religion. And everything was very quiet because in Israel in those days, on the Sabbath and on the holy days, there was no traffic. People were with their families. It was quiet. All of a sudden, I saw jeeps rushing down the street, stopping in front of apartment buildings, people in military uniforms jumping out and piling into the jeeps, and then they would go to another house and the same scene would be repeated. I didn't actually even know what was going on. And I talked to someone and they said, there's a war, we've been attacked. I chose to stay in Israel during the war. I was an incurable romantic. And I thought, well, if the Jewish people are going to be killed, I'm a Jew, I'll go with them. So I'm not going to leave. I would find it hard to live with myself, to sleep at night, if I thought I abandoned my own people at the time of them being attacked. After the war, I came back to the university. It reopened. One of my close friends there had been killed. He was a Jewish immigrant from France. All kinds of changes had taken place. And when I was in the university, the studies of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, seemed very intellectual, devoid of life. And I thought, I'm not going to stay here. And I went back to the United States. And I considered various places I could study. One of them was the University of California at Santa Cruz. They had a doctoral program in human consciousness. I thought this would be perfect. But in the end, I went to the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago allowed me to create my own graduate program, and I created a program where I got a double degree in psychology and comparative religion. My time at the University of Chicago lasted for a few years. I loved the research, I loved writing papers, and I did very well. Now, while I was there, I also really experienced major depression for the first time. And I walked into the office of Carl Weintraub, who was the head of the division that I was studying in. He didn't even look up. And I said, Dr. Weintraub, I'm depressed. I don't know what to do. And he just continued to work with his papers. And he said, Mr. Goodman, this is the University of Chicago. Everyone here is depressed. Well, that should have been a hint, but I didn't take the hint. And I got my master's degree. And at the very end, they asked me to write a little paper. They loved my master's thesis, which was on Kabbalah in the Middle Ages in Spain. I translated a book from Hebrew and wrote about it. And they said, we'd like for you to write a little critique. We want you to tell us how your field, in this case, Jewish mysticism, the academic study of Jewish mysticism could be improved. Well, I was so naive. Maybe I still am. And I thought, oh, that's obvious. The people who are writing all of these papers and books and everything about it in the universities, they don't even believe in God. Now, honestly, I wasn't a deep believer in God either at the time, but I sure could spot someone who wasn't. That wasn't a problem. So I wrote that. They didn't like what I wrote. I was called to the office of Dr. Weintraub again, and he said, Jonathan Z. Smith, who was my advisor, who I'd met with all of 1 or 2 times I was there, so angry with what you wrote that he wants you to be dismissed from the university, thrown out. And I was thrown out of the university. Dr. Weintraub said to me, Mr. Goodman, you have a bad attitude. In retrospect, he was right. But at the time, I thought, okay, the reality is I suddenly am persona non grata here. What am I going to do? I love books. I love study. I went across the road to the Regenstein Library, upon which is written in Latin, The Life of the Mind. You see, the University of Chicago in those days didn't have any athletic teams. Everything was study and intellect, the life of the mind. I went into the library, and as I was walking in over to the right-hand side, I saw a doorway leading to another part of the building, and it said Graduate Library School. And I thought, oh, now that I am thrown out of the graduate program across the street and I have no more money, I'll become a librarian. I'll be with books and it'll be great. I walked in and there was an office of the director. And I said, I'd like to speak to the director. And the secretary said, you can't just waltz in here and ask to speak to the director. You have to make an appointment. And from behind her, I heard a lady's voice saying, who is it? And she said, some kid came in here and wants to talk with you. She said, well, I have a moment, send them in. So I introduced myself and I said, I want to be in the library school. She said, well, you know, it's a 2-year master's program. I told her about what had happened across the street. I had been thrown out, but I did have a master's. She said, well, you'll do it in 1 year. And I did. I became the resident expert in Judaica librarianship. I wrote articles on it and I did very well. I knew all the languages and I was great. And come to think of it, and I didn't know this up until recently, I've always been great. But I didn't know it. Now I do. I hope that you know that about yourself too. You're great and really know it. So anyway, I went through the library school, got a degree in library science, and I finally ended up as a law librarian at Rutgers University, New Jersey, Newark, New Jersey Law Library. I was there for about a year, and the head of the law library came to me and he said, you know, this is a faculty position. I said, really? He said, yeah, you're a faculty member. I said, wow, I didn't know that. No one ever told me. This is the story of my life, by the way. No one ever told me. He said, if you already have a graduate degree in library science, you already have published. I didn't even think that I was published, but one day I went to the Women's Rights Law Reporter because I wanted to be published. I wanted to write and do stuff. And so I said, I'll write you an article on women's rights materials in government documents, which no one had ever done. I'm sure if you go back to the late 70s, you'll find that article. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by the way, was also teaching there at the time. So, of course, nobody knew who she was. Come to think of it, nobody knew who Harold Goodman was. You see, we all eventually rise to the top and we become known. So anyway, he said, and if you get a law degree, you'll get tenure. And you can have your job for life. And I thought, is that supposed to be an inducement to get tenure? He said, we'll pay for law school. You can have your job here. You'll work in the nighttime. And the daytime you'll go to law school. Instead of 3, it'll take you 4 years. And I thought, I really need to think about this. I said, I'll get back to you. And what I did was I went and asked the secretary for my work to leave me alone. And I closed the door, sat in my office. And as I said, I didn't believe in God, but I did believe in imagination. And I said, well, if a good fairy could come and give me a choice as to what I want to do with my life, what would I really like to do? I know not to be a law librarian. And my mother, who was a school teacher, taught me to make a list of the positive and the negative for each thing. And I thought, what I'd really, really like to do, but I want to do it so badly, and I know that I could never do this. I just know it because everyone's told me that I'm good at the humanities, not at the sciences, but I would really like to be a doctor. But not a doctor like the doctors that I know, who always made me feel uncomfortable and like there's something wrong with me. But a doctor who made people happy, a doctor who knew that people are healthy, a doctor who saw people as okay, and then build from there. And I thought, well, I guess that means I'd have to go to medical school and I'd have to study science, and everyone's told me I'm terrible at science. But I thought, why not? So I started asking all these people, advisors and other people, and every single person, except for one person, said, you'll never make it. You're white, you're Jewish, you're a man. There are too many people like you already in medicine. Forget about it. Do something else with your life. And I thought, the fairy said I could do whatever I want. And let me tell you, fairies know what they're doing. That's been my experience. I'd rather trust a fairy than trust someone who's not. So what happened was, I thought, I'll experiment a little bit. And I thought, I'll find the lowest level of academic excellence that I can find where I can take courses in the subjects that terrify me, like math and science. Jersey City State College, here I come. I got on the PATH train and I would go there twice a week in the evening. And I took a class in calculus and I took a class in general chemistry. I never knew what calculus was. I didn't know why I was going to class. I didn't understand what we were doing. And I got a C. And I thought, if I can get a C and I don't even know what the fuck this is all about, imagine what I could do if I go to medical school. Chemistry, same thing. I got a C. I didn't know what they were talking about. All of these different letters and things, and I didn't know what they were doing. But I said, good. I survived. I survived calculus. I don't know what it is. And I survived general chemistry equally zippo. And finally, someone introduced me to a lady in New York City who was married to a professor of medicine who lived across from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, I come from a family where, let's put it, we were middle class, maybe a little bit lower middle class. And so when I went to visit her, because I called and she was willing to talk with me, she worked as a student advising minority students for Columbia University School of Medicine. I went into New York, I took the subway up, and I walked along Fifth Avenue, and I came to this building that had a doorman and looked like a museum. I thought, people actually live here? And he said, whom shall I say is calling? And I said, me? He said, you need to give a name. I said, Harold Goodman. And he got on his phone. He said, 9B. I said, okay. I thought we were playing bingo or something. Got in an elevator run by an elderly man who went like this, and we went up, and I got out, and there was a rug on the floor along a long corridor, and I walked all the way down to 9B. And I pressed the little button, and it went ding, 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 ding. And I thought, people actually live this way? The door opened, and this woman said, a servant, she said, Mrs. So-and-so will see you now in the anteroom. And I said, what? What kind of a room? Ants? And she said, come with me. She led me in, and there was this big chair, and there was another chair facing it, and the lady was sitting there. And she said, what can I do for you? And I didn't know what to say. And she said, I understand you want to go to medical school. I said, I really would. I want to go to medical school. I don't want to go to law school. She was like, what? And I want to go to medical school. She said, tell me about yourself, and I did. She kind of peered through her glasses at me and said, well, you probably won't get in. And then she saw the look on my face. She said, but if you don't try, you'll never know. That's the only thing I took away with me. She was the only person who ever said to me, if you don't try, you'll never know. At that time, I was in Newark, living north of Newark. And I decided to enroll at the Rutgers University campus in Newark to take pre-med classes. And in the nighttime, in order to support myself, because when I told them at the law library that I was not going to go to law school, they told me to leave. So I had lost my job. I was working a part-time job at the Newark Public Library, every evening and on Saturdays. And I started looking, this is way before computers, I started looking through all the reference books on medical schools. And I noticed there were these medical schools that gave a different degree than the MD degree, called the DO degree. Now, years before, I had sent a letter to a homeopathic organization saying I wanted to be a homeopathic physician, and they said, well, you either need an MD or a DO degree. So that's the first time I heard about the DO, or the Doctor of Osteopathy degree. But I had only seen MDs in my life. I didn't know DOs. I thought this was a scam. How could it be that I, who know everything, didn't know about this whole medical profession? Anyway, I told my mother, and she said, if you apply to MD schools, I will pay for all of your applications. They were about $50 each at that time. And I thought, well, that'll save a lot of money. Not a single MD school would talk to me. In fact, one time I called up and asked about my application, and the lady who answered the phone, she said, we're not even going to look at your application because of your age. You're too old. At that time, by the way, I was 29. But these DO schools, the osteopathic schools, were very happy to talk with me. In fact, they said to me, we love people who have had practical experience in life. We don't want people who are just out of their mother's womb. Finally, I got some interviews with osteopathic schools. My first interview was with an osteopathic school in Des Moines, Iowa. I got on a plane, I went to Des Moines. I had relatives there. I thought it's a city, there are Jewish people there are gay people there, it's diverse, it's all kinds of neat people. But I had read about osteopathy, and I had read about Kirksville, Missouri, which is where it all began. So the next stop on my interview schedule was to go to the Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine. Well, I got on a bus and I went to Ottumwa. And from there we went south towards Kirksville. I was so excited. Kirksville, the mecca of osteopathy. And the bus stopped Kirksville at the time at 17,000 people. It was the largest place in Adair County, Missouri. And I got off the bus and I looked around and I saw Hardee's. And right across from the Hardee's, there was an old building from the 1920s or 30s, and it said Kirksville College of Osteopathy and Surgery. When I had walked into the building, it was deserted. And I went into the Hardee's, and there was this guy with a John Deere cap sitting there having hamburger and a big soda. And I said, do you know where the Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine is located? And he just looked at me and said, oh, you mean the osteopathetics? And I said, do you know where it's located? He said, just walk down the road here over the railroad tracks. And I thought, railroad tracks? So I went out and I walked over the railroad tracks and saw these beautiful buildings and a nice campus. And I thought, oh, okay, this is a real medical school. And I had gotten an interview with an old professor there who was the friend of someone I had met in New Jersey, an osteopathic physician. And I was all excited about osteopathy and the fact that Andrew Taylor Still, the man who discovered osteopathy, was into spiritualism and spirituality. And I told him all about that. And he said, we don't talk about those things. This is a scientific medical school. We don't get involved in those things. And I thought, I'm here. Whatever I have to say to get in, I'll do it. So I had another interview with Dr. Peisner, who was a physiologist. And she said, I see you're Jewish. And I was like, what does that have to do with anything? She said, are you going to need kosher food while you're here? I said, I just want to eat. I don't care. And I said, when will I hear from you? And she said, very soon. And I think you'll be happy with the response. And I was like, really? It turns out that the man I had just met with was a legend. And he had told them, I want him in here. So it was a done deal. But no one told me. What do I know? It's the story of my life. No one told me. And then I went home. And I was working in the public library, as I said, in the evening. And all of these rejections had been coming every day from all the MD schools. And I used to call my mother, who was not the most positive person I have ever met in my life. And she said, there's more mail for you. And I said, there is? She said, yeah, there's some medical school in Iowa. I said, oh, open it up. And she said, it's a mistake. I said, just read it. She said, it says, dear Dr. Goodman, welcome to the class of whatever. And I said, that's great. I was hoping she would congratulate me, but that was just a little too much for her. So what she said was, you can't go. You don't have any money. We don't have any money. I said, well, I'll take out a loan. She said, it's bad to take out loans. You should never take out a loan in your whole life. You don't want to owe people money. I didn't have a credit card. We paid with checks from the Howard Savings Bank in Newark. And I said, well, I'll be a doctor. I can pay back the loan. And she said, who would ever hire you? I said, no, I'm going to have my own practice. She said, what if no one comes? She was a very shrewd person. She always had a good answer. Except that they were always seeing the glass half empty. But it only took me 40 years more to realize that. And I went to Kirksville. And I was higher than a kite. I was so happy. I was finally doing what I was meant to do. And the very first day, they gathered all of the freshmen in a hall. And an old doctor who I never saw again, and I don't know his name or where he came from, he walked on the stage and he looked at everyone and he said, none of you will ever heal anyone. All healing comes from God. And I was like, I think I'm in the right school. I started my courses. We had anatomy. We had histology, which is a form of microanatomy, and other courses, physiology. And we also had osteopathic theory and methods, which basically is osteopathic diagnosis and treatment. For the first 6 months, they had us putting our hands on other students and just feeling. learning to feel, learning to palpate with our hands. And the first day, they divided us up, and I put my hand on another student, and they said, "What do you feel?" And I was so here, so stuck in my head that I couldn't feel anything consciously. And I thought, I don't know. I'm not feeling anything. What am I supposed to feel? And everyone else is smiling. And I'm thinking, I'm the only one who can't feel. I came so far and I did so many things to come here, and I can't feel anything. I went home and I cried. And then I said, Harold David Goodman, you're here at the Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine. You're a freshman. They took you. They believe you can do it. And you're paying them money. You're going to do it. You're going to be an osteopathic physician. And even if you're the worst osteopathic physician in the whole history of this profession, you'll still be a DO, a doctor of osteopathy. And that's the beginning of my osteopathic journey. Thank you.